If you've been with us, you know that in recent weeks we've been talking about how to live Christian lives above average. And we've looked at the fact a couple weeks ago it begins in our minds. And we talked about the fact that we need to learn to live differently if we want to live lives that are above average. Last week we talked about the importance of engaging our hearts if we want to live courageously and live above average. And today we're talking about standing courageously, as we heard also in the scriptures this morning. We're going to talk about a man, Gideon, who was very flawed, and things he did were not everything he did was a good example to us, but we can learn from the good and from the not so good perhaps. But let's put this in kind of biblical, historical context just for a few moments to kind of get us started on today's thoughts. If you look in your Bible, Genesis, talks about Abraham, and God made a promise to Abraham and said, Abraham, I'm going to give you a land. I'm going to give you, your people are going to have, you're going to be a nation, and you're going to have a land, and I'll give you a land to live on. And Abraham's great-grandson, Joseph, you know the story. He was sold as a slave and taken into Egypt, and his descendants lived there for some 400 years in Egypt. And over that time, they became slaves to the Egyptians. The book of Exodus, the second book in the Old Testament, along comes Moses, and he helps them leave Egypt and escape from Egypt, and they spend about 40 years camping in the wilderness, in the promised, not in the promised land, in the deserts between Egypt and the promised land. And then the book of Leviticus and Numbers and Deuteronomy, if you're reading those are tough books to get through because a lot of laws, a lot of instructions, a lot of guidance, a lot of statutes that God gives, and God sets up a lot of boundaries for living in those three books. Joshua, great book, talks about Joshua leading the people from the desert into the land that God had promised to Abraham many, many years before then. And so Joshua does that, but they have some challenges there. Book of Judges, the next book, they're now living in their land, and they don't want to be herdsmen anymore. They want to have homes. They want to plant gardens. They want to have fields. They want to grow their crops. And so they're starting to settle themselves there. They're trying to settle down in this promised land. But all was not well as they attempted to do so. We'll start by reading Judges chapter 2 and verse 10 is one of the things that were not good for them. 2 and verse 10, after that whole generation had been gathered to their ancestors, another generation grew up who knew neither the Lord nor what he had done for Israel. These people were those that grew up and somehow the message hadn't got to many of them what God had done for their ancestors in Egypt, what God had done for them in bringing them out of Egypt. And it's sad because I'm told some people say that this next generation will be the first non-Christian generation in America, in our world. Because in some ways, some people say that the message is not being told to the younger people of today. And they're growing up, many of them, not all of course, many of them are growing up not knowing the Lord, and another generation has risen. This is the first problem they had in the book of Judges. And then Judges 2, verse 12 has another problem they have. It says, they forsook the Lord, the God of their ancestors who'd brought them out of Egypt, and they followed and worshiped various gods of the peoples around them. Problem number 2. The first one was they were not told about what God had done for their ancestors many years before. The second problem was because they were living among people who did not believe in God, they took on the customs, they took on the religious practices of those people around them and caused them problems. The third big problem that leads us to where we are today is found in chapter 17 of Judges and verse 6. And it applies to the whole book of Judges. And it says here, in those days, Israel had no king, and everyone did as they saw fit. When God is not a part of our lives, something else will take its place. Someone has said that we have a God-shaped vacuum in our souls, and when that vacuum is not filled with God, something else will take that place. We'll try to fill that with something. And when we move away from God's leading, we don't have a moral compass anymore. And we will go in whatever direction we may choose to go. And sadly, we're seeing that even today. And also, part of this stems from the problem that God told them when they moved into this land, clear the land of people. The people there shouldn't live there because I've given you the land. And there's many places in Judges where it says they tried to take on the Canaanites, they left them there. They didn't do what God told them to do. And so for years, these Canaanites and Midianites and other ites came and attacked the Jewish people there because they did not follow God's laws. Their children married children who were unbelievers. They adopted the religions of people around them, and their enemies kept attacking their farms. Look at what it says in Judges chapter 6, starting at verse 2. It's very interesting here because it kind of sets up our story here. Starting at verse 2, Judges 6, because the power of Midian was so oppressive, the Israelites prepared shelters for themselves in mountain clefts, caves, and strongholds. And whenever the Israelites planted their crops, the Midianites, the Amalekites, and other eastern peoples invaded the country. They camped on the land and ruined the crops all the way to Gaza and did not spare a living thing for Israel, neither sheep or cattle or donkeys. They came up with their livestock and their tents like swarms of locusts. It was impossible to count them on their camels. They invaded the land to ravage it. Midian so impoverished the Israelites that they cried out to the Lord for help. And when the Israelites cried out to the Lord because of Midian, he sent them a prophet. The first step we want to think about today in living above average and wanting to live Christian lives above average, is to acknowledge our deficiencies. And when we slip up, to acknowledge the Lord, to cry to the Lord and say, Lord, I've made a mistake, and I want you to help me out of this, or I want you to guide me where I need to go. And the good example here is that people cried to the Lord and said, Lord, something's not right. We need some help. To be able to acknowledge help is a great way to begin to live our lives above average. And so God sent them a prophet. And God said, I've got someone to help you. It's interesting because the passage that the commissioner read talks about that in Judges, the first few verses of chapter 6 here, because it says that the angel came and said to Gideon, "Oh, you mighty warrior." I sense there was maybe some sarcasm in that, maybe not, because where was Gideon when the angel came and told him this? The Gideon was threshing wheat. Now, you probably know that if you thresh wheat, you've got to go to a high plateau where the wind blows, because the wheat is connected to the stalk, and they usually walk a donkey or an oxen around this plateau, and the oxen will walk on the wheat and crunch it up, and then they'll get these big, huge forks, and they'll throw up in the air, and the wind on that plateau will blow, and the lighter chaff will blow away, and the heavier grain will fall down, and they use that to make their bread. But Gideon was doing this, but he wasn't on the plateau. He wasn't on the threshing floor out above everything because the enemy could see it. He was actually threshing his wheat in a small place called the place where they make grapes, the grape place. And so they were pressing, he was in the wine press, a small area covered by a wall where people would put the grapes in there and they would stomp on them, barefoot, I guess. And they'd stomp all over these grapes and get the juice out of them. And imagine him trying to thresh the wheat in this small place where there's no breeze. He's probably picking up the grain and saying, okay, this one's good, I'll keep that one. And this one's not good, I'll throw that one away. And imagine trying to do that in such an enclosed place. And the angel of God comes and says, Gideon, you are a mighty warrior. I would have felt foolish if God came to me in that situation and said, you're a mighty warrior. Go do something huge. Gideon was scared. And he had questions and concerns as we were read. He said to the angel, listen, if the Lord is with us, why are we having all these problems? Where are all the miracles that I heard about in reading the history books about what God did to my ancestors? Where are all these miracles? Well, they're not happening here. And how can I save Israel, he says, because my family, we're the littlest family. We're really nobodies. We're at the bottom of the totem pole. And me, I'm at the bottom of the totem pole. If we want to live lives above average, we need to not look at our circumstances around us. We need to not hide ourselves when we do our jobs, but we need to look at God. and look at our lives through God's eyes, because he was looking down at the circumstances around him and says, what is going on, God? I can't figure this out. And he wasn't looking toward God. And God said to him after Gideon gives all these complaints, God says, listen, go in your strength, because I'm going to give you strength, and I will be with you. Now, Gideon had the bad habit of asking God to prove himself. Not a good example. I wouldn't suggest doing this. I wouldn't suggest this is a good example of a person who is flying high like an eagle, who's a great warrior, because he first of all says to the angel, well, give me proof that you're really from God. Angel says, okay, you stay here, Gideon, and fix me a meal, and I'll come back. And he came back, and this is in chapter 6, verses 17. You can read that. And the angel of God touched the meal with the rod, and it poof, and it vanished, and it was burned up. And Gideon thought, wow, I have seen the face of God. And I would think if I saw the face of God, if you saw the face of God, wouldn't that convince you this must be the real thing? Well, Gideon needed some more proof. If you look at chapter 6, verse 36 to 40, you may have heard the term putting out a fleece. Well, it comes from here. Because Gideon said, God, I'm not real sure. I need some more proof that you're going to do what you're going to say. And so in chapter 6, he says, listen, I'm going to put a sheep's fleece on the threshing floor, because it wasn't used for anything else. And he put it out there, and he said, listen, maybe if at night, maybe that fleece will be wet, and around it the ground will be dried. If that happens, I will know that you're in control of the situation. Now, God doesn't always play along when we put these things to him, but God decided to play along with Gideon that time. And so, as you know, the fleece, as Gideon said, the fleece was wet that first morning. All around it was dry. And Gideon thought, well, that could have been just chance. Let me try it again, God. If you're really God, and he comes to him, he says, God, don't get mad at me. I have just one more request, God, just one more, and it will really convince me that you're real. And so he said, let's do the opposite. If I put that fleece out there, I want the fleece to be dry, and I want the ground to be wet. And you know that God played along, and that's really what happened. Not a good example for those of us who want to live lives above average. Well, Gideon's training was done now, and it was time for him to exercise his faith. And there's even another time where God has to prove to him. We're not going to talk about today, but in chapter 6, verse 33, it talks about the fact that he said, okay, guys, we've got about 150 to 200,000 enemy down there. Who's going to come battle against them? 32,000 brave men showed up. And they said, okay, we're good. Now, the odds were still not good. Maybe 5 enemy soldiers to every Israelite soldier. And so if you're a gambling man, you wouldn't want to go that way. And God says, as you know the story well, God says in chapter 7, verse 2, Gideon, you got too many, because you might think that you had something to do with this. And so in chapter 7, verse 3, God says, now anyone who trembles with fear may turn back and leave. So out of that 32,000, 22,000 men left. They probably ran the odds. They probably knew their math and thought, it's not going to happen. I'm going home. So they left. That left only 10,000. Now the odds are a little bit worse, about 15 enemy soldiers to every Jewish man. And God says, Gideon, you got too many still, because you might boast that you had something to do with this. And so God had a way to sift out the eagles, to sift out those living their faith above average, and it worked down to 300 men against hundreds of thousands. Impossible. The odds are 500 to 1. There's no way. There is no way this can happen. And God says in chapter 7, verse 7, with these 300 men, I will save you. I'm going to invite you to turn to chapter 7 and verse 17, because Gideon says this, watch me, follow my lead. And then Gideon says, you do what I do, and I will shout the sword of the Lord and of Gideon. And in verse 20, he said to the men, you do the same thing. People who acknowledge their faith, people who want to live life above average, will acknowledge their allegiance to Christ, will acknowledge their allegiance to God. And they'll be proud to say, I belong to Christ. I'm a Christ follower. I'm a Jesus believer. And people will follow. So even with all his flaws, even with all his need for proof, even with all his problems he had, at that time, Gideon and his 300 men stood courageously. And you know the story. They stood on the outside, and the Midianites just killed each other because they thought there was a much bigger army than there was. It took a while to get there, didn't it? Gideon had to go through some things. He had to be taught. God had to teach him. God had to work with him. But Gideon became, in this case, someone who was living lives above average, an eagle who was soaring. But I think it's interesting because many of us think the story ends there, but it doesn't end there. If you turn to chapter 8 of Judges, it's interesting because starting at verse 22, the people now, they're victorious and the Midianites are defeated and Gideon is revered. In verse 22 of chapter 8, the Israelites said to Gideon, "Rule over us, you, your son, and your grandson, because you have saved us from the hand of Midian." But Gideon told them, "I will not rule over you, nor will my son rule over you. The Lord will rule over you." As a human, I suppose it was a temptation for him to say, well, yes, I guess I had something to do with this. And maybe God is putting me in a place of leadership. Maybe he wants me to rule over these people. Maybe he wants me to be their guide because this battle went so well and I followed God. But he realized it wasn't him that did it. It was God that did it through him. If we're living lives above average, if we're living lives soaring like eagles, lives that are pleasing to him, that we will not accept the glory after God uses us. But we'll know that the glory is all his. And that he's the one who makes us who we are. He's the one who allows us to be in situations where we can share his glory. He's the one that fights the battles for us, as we sang just a few minutes ago. So if your life, hope not, is humdrum, if you have fallen into a routine in your faith and maybe so, maybe not, well, God has called each one of us, I believe, to live lives above average, to live lives where we can soar as eagles. And it begins in our minds, not being conformed to the world around us, but transformed by the renewing of our minds. As we talked about Joshua and Caleb a couple weeks ago, we need to be able to live differently than those around us, not being afraid to stand for the truth, even if it means, in their case, being in the minority. Once our minds are made up, we engage our hearts in living above average lives for him. And in every aspect of our worship, every aspect of our lives, our relationship with other people, not simply not doing wrong, but doing right, as we talked about last week. And we need to be prepared when he gives us the strength and the guidance to stand courageously as the Lord makes himself known to us. The battle is the Lord's. Let us live our lives of faith above average. Let us soar like eagles in our Christian lives. And the only way we can do this is to make sure that Christ is above all else in our lives. Let Christ be your all in all.